Have you ever watched someone cry in complete silence and realized they weren't just sad, but hiding Elias McRae, a widowed rancher deep in the Arizona desert, thought his house had already seen the worst kind of silence after the fire that took his wife and child. But then came Sadie, a 21-year-old girl who never spoke, but cooked with care and cried into soup when she thought no one was looking. One knock at the door changed everything. What would you do if the law said to send her back to the man who broke her, but your heart said no? This is not a story about romance. It's about grief that lingers, silence that speaks, and two people learning how to live, again, not through words, but through warmth. Stay with us. This story may just echo something you've been holding inside. The wind moved in lazy spirals across the Arizona plains, carrying the scent of dry earth, sagebrush, and a faint trace of burnt wood that Elias McRae never seemed to stop smelling, even after all these years. The light outside had gone soft and gold, slipping across the wide sky like butter melting on cast iron. As Elias pushed open the creaking door of his ranch house, the familiar silence wrapped around him, thick and empty like the dust that settled in every corner. But tonight, that silence held something different. The scent of stew drifted from the kitchen beef, potatoes, a hint of thyme, but stronger than anything was the sharp sting of chili peppers. Elias frowned. He had never liked spicy food, never had the stomach for it, not since Abigail passed. He dropped his gloves by the door and stepped into the kitchen, his boots echoing against the pine floorboards. The girl was standing at the stove, back turned, wooden spoon in hand. Her name was Sadie Quinn. He barely knew her. She'd only been there 3 weeks, sent by Father Coulson from the mission church over in Jerome. Said she had nowhere else to go. Quiet girl, didn't speak, did the work without complaint, cooked decently, cleaned better. He hadn't expected much, didn't want much either. But something was wrong. Sadie's shoulders were shaking, not like she was cold, like something inside her had cracked. He took another step. Slower now. "You trying to burn my tongue off," he said, his voice low and rough from years of dust and disuse. No answer. She didn't even flinch. He narrowed his eyes and stepped beside her. That's when he saw it. A tear fell from her cheek, slow and silent, landing in the pot with a quiet sizzle. The wooden spoon trembled in her hand. Elias stared, unsure what to do with the sight of a girl crying into his supper. He wasn't a man who knew how to handle feelings not his, and especially not someone else's. "You all right?" he asked gruffly. She quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her dress and gave a small shake of her head. No words, just that. Her eyes didn't meet his. He grunted, scratching the back of his neck. "Well," he muttered, "guess a little heat won't kill me." She nodded once, barely. "Dinner in 10, he added, though he had no appetite. He walked away. But his mind stayed in that kitchen. He sat at the table by the window, watching the last light fade behind the distant ridges. Somewhere out near the empty barn, a coyote howled a lonely sound that always made his bones ache. He reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out the small journal he never wrote in anymore, just held. A gift from Abigail the winter before the fire. 4 years. That's how long it had been since the fire took them. His wife, his daughter, his entire life reduced to cinders and silence. He hadn't rebuilt the back wing of the house where their rooms were, just boarded it off. He couldn't bear the smell of charred wood or the creak of the floor that once heard his daughter's laughter. Now a stranger lived under his roof, quiet as a shadow and crying into a pot of stew. When the soup was done, Sadie ladled it into two mismatched bowls and placed one gently in front of him. She didn't sit until he had taken a bite. The heat hit his tongue like a slap, but he didn't flinch. "It's good," he said after a moment. He meant it. Sadie gave the faintest nod and ate in silence. Later that evening, after she'd cleared the dishes and disappeared into the back room she'd made into a nest of quiet corners. Elias wandered back into the kitchen to check the stove. That's when he saw it half tucked under the leg of the table, like it had been dropped and forgotten. A small handkerchief, pale and thin, with delicate embroidery in one corner. S.Q. He picked it up. It was still damp. His chest tightened. This wasn't the kind of sadness that passed in an afternoon. This was the kind that lived in your bones, in your breath, in your silence. And somehow, it had taken up residence in his house. He placed the cloth gently on the edge of the table and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, Elias McRae stood still, listening to the wind scrape along the window like a voice too tired to speak. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "Don't like spicy food," but he would eat every bowl she made, every last one. Because tonight, someone had cried in his kitchen, and that changed something. Before Sadie Quinn came into Elias McRae's house, silence was just part of the furniture. It creaked in the floors, seeped into the grain of the wood, hung heavy on every beam like desert dust. He didn't resent it. He had learned to live inside it, like a shell, like a scab. After all, silence doesn't argue. It doesn't remind you of things you can't undo. But now, even that familiar quiet had changed. Ever since the night he saw tears hit the stew pot, Elias found himself listening in a different way, listening for things not said, for footsteps softer than memory, for grief that hummed beneath a girl's breath. He couldn't sleep that night. Not properly. Just sat in his old leather chair by the fire, boots off, knees aching, staring into the flames as they cracked and danced and whispered. The wind outside moaned low across the Arizona plain, slipping under the windows like a ghost too tired to haunt. The shadows moved across the walls, and sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he saw her, not Sadie, Abigail. In the flicker of firelight, in the shimmer off the glass, he'd catch a glimpse of her hand brushing her dark hair behind one ear, her eyes laughing at something he'd said. Then the image would vanish and leave him aching all over again. Abigail had been warmth, laughter, a song on her lips, and a hand always reaching toward someone else. She'd loved the kitchen, loved Sunday mornings with flour on her nose, and their daughter, Lily, giggling beside her. She had a way of making the house feel alive, even when the wind howled and the cows got loose and the rain came in sideways. Then came the fire. It had started in the barn. They said, some ember from the forge, some spark from the hay. That was the official story. But Elias had never quite believed it. He remembered too well the smell of kerosene on the wind, the way the blaze jumped from timber to timber like it had been fed. He remembered running barefoot through smoke so thick it choked him, remembered Abigail pushing Lily into his arms and screaming for him to go, to run, to save her. But he couldn't carry them both, not through the flames, not without dying there himself. So he'd run with Lily. And then the beam fell. She'd died screaming. Lily had followed days later, her lungs too weak for the smoke she'd breathed. By then, Elias was half mad with grief, hoarse from shouting her name into the ashes. He buried them on the ridge under the mesquite tree that still dropped yellow blossoms in spring. After that, he closed the house, boarded up the wing where Lily had painted horses on the wall, sold most of the cattle, stopped going into town unless absolutely necessary. The ranch shrank into a routine tend the fence, feed the horses, mend the roof, check the water troughs. Day after day, month after month, people stopped visiting, and that was fine. He didn't need voices, didn't need pity, didn't need anything until Sadie arrived. She came on the back of a supply wagon, hat pulled low, satchel smaller than a loaf of bread. Father Coulson had sent her with only a note. This girl has nowhere else to go. She's quiet, gentle, won't be any trouble. Elias hadn't wanted to take her in, but the priest had looked him in the eye and said, "You know what it means to be alone. So does she." He didn't have an answer for that, so he cleared out the old seed room behind the kitchen and gave her a bedroll and a shelf. She didn't ask for more, didn't even speak, just nodded when he told her the house rules don't go near the locked rooms. Don't burn the coffee, don't touch the liquor shelf. Sadie moved through the house like she wasn't sure she was allowed to exist in it. She walked softly, cleaned thoroughly, cooked with more care than expected from someone barely 20. But she never smiled, never laughed, never said a word. At first, Elias assumed she was mute. Some girls were. After enough trauma, he'd seen it once, during the war, young nurse. Survived a raid, never spoke again. But Sadie's silence felt like something else, like a choice, like a punishment, or maybe protection. He'd see her sometimes in the garden, touching the wilted herbs like she wanted to remember their names. Other times, she stood at the edge of the pasture, eyes fixed on the mountains like she was waiting for someone or running from them. Elias never asked. He wasn't one to pry. The house had run better since she came, and for that, he was quietly grateful. But after the stew and the tears, things shifted. Something about that moment clung to him. He kept thinking about the handkerchief, damp and folded, initials stitched by a hand that once believed in permanence. He thought of Lily's baby blanket, still in a trunk, still smelling of ash. The next morning, Elias rose before the sun, poured himself a cup of black coffee that tasted like dirt, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, dry, holding that strange desert chill that came before the heat. He looked toward the barn, toward the place where it had all ended. The boards had been replaced, the roof mended, but something underneath still burned. Sadie came out minutes later, hair tucked into a braid, sleeves rolled up. She didn't say good morning. She never did. Just nodded and walked to the pump to fetch water. And Elias, for the first time in 4 years, found himself wanting to say something, anything. But instead, he said nothing. He just watched her walk, the hem of her dress brushing against the dirt, and wondered what kind of fire she had walked through to end up here. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both began to follow as naturally as breath. Mornings came early, with the pale blue light crawling over the ridges to the east, spilling slowly into the house through the thin, warped window panes. Elias would rise before the sun, as he always had, make a pot of bitter coffee, thick as molasses, and sit on the front steps with his old boots untied, watching the sky shift from black to gold. Sadie moved like a shadow behind him, never loud, never abrupt. She'd come out moments after, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled to her elbows, eyes still heavy from sleep, but never letting on. She fetched water without being asked, chopped vegetables with a kind of reverence, swept the floor even when it was already clean. And when breakfast was ready, she placed it on the table with a quiet grace that felt older than her years. They didn't speak, not much, not yet, but there was something building in the spaces between their silences. One morning, after a night of restless wind, Elias noticed a chipped mug turned upside down on the porch rail. Inside was a folded piece of paper, edges curled from the dew. His name was scrawled across it, small and slanted. He opened it slowly. "Thank you for the coffee." That was all it said. He stared at the words for longer than necessary, then folded the note back up and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, where it would stay. Next to the letter Abigail wrote him on their 5th anniversary, the one he still couldn't bring himself to reread. That day, he poured an extra cup of coffee and set it quietly across from him on the table. Sadie sat and drank it without a word, but for the first time, her eyes met his, just for a second. And then she looked away. That night, as the sun bled out behind the canyon and the coyotes started their low, distant song, Elias found himself lingering in the kitchen while she cooked. She moved with a kind of measured calm, not slow, not rushed, just precise, as if every action mattered. She tasted the soup once, paused, added a pinch of salt, and stirred again. He leaned against the doorway and cleared his throat. "Used to be," he said quietly. "My wife would put too much sugar in everything. Claimed it was an accident. But I knew better." Sadie didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth moved just barely. A twitch, not quite a smile, but not nothing either. Elias continued. "One time she poured half a cup into stew. I told her she was going to kill me." Still no reply. But he caught the tiniest glance, quick, careful, like she was checking to see if he was joking. He was sort of. The next morning, a note appeared by his plate. "I don't use sugar in stew." No signature. Just the handwriting again, awkward, unsure, with letters that leaned hard to the left. That evening, Elias brought down an old tin box from the high shelf in the pantry. Inside were recipes Abigail had scribbled years ago, some on parchment, some on the backs of seed catalogs, others just fragments written in charcoal on brown paper. He laid one out on the table, sweet milk cornbread Sunday mornings only. He pushed it gently toward Sadie. "I think it's still good," he said. She stared at the paper a long while, then traced the crooked words with her fingertip, slow and careful. Then she nodded. The next Sunday, the smell of cornbread filled the house for the first time in 4 years. Elias didn't say a word while he ate it. He didn't need to. It tasted like memory and sorrow and something close to peace. As the days warmed and the dust settled after spring's brief tantrum of wind and cold, Sadie began to leave small notes in strange places, folded scraps under Elias's mug, clipped to the clothesline, once tucked into the brim of his old hat. They were never long, just little observations. "The birds came back today. I fixed the loose nail on the pantry door. I like how the floor creaks in the morning. It sounds like the house is waking up too." Elias found himself looking forward to them. He didn't reply, not in writing, but he started making gestures of his own. Sharpened her kitchen knife without her asking, oiled the door hinges so they didn't squeal, hung new curtains in her room, stitched from Abigail's old fabric stash. Late one afternoon, Sadie was pulling weeds near the edge of the fence line, her hands covered in dirt. When Elias brought over a glass of water, she stood, brushing the dust from her skirt, and reached for the glass with both hands. Their fingers touched, just briefly. She didn't flinch, neither did he. Something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but something smaller and steadier. A flicker of recognition, a kind of unspoken permission to begin again. That evening, after supper, Elias lit the fire and sat in his chair. Sadie placed her notebook on the mantel before disappearing into the back room. He waited a while before rising. He opened the notebook, half expecting another short note, but it was a drawing, just a simple one, a crooked sketch of the kitchen, with the stove and the table and two chairs facing each other. He stared at it until the fire went low. And then he turned the page. The days crept on, soft as dust. But something beneath the silence had started to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but the way dry wood starts to creak before it splits, or how the wind changes just before a monsoon sweeps across the desert. Elias McRae had lived long enough to recognize the signs, not always with storms, but with people too. There were moments now when Sadie Quinn lingered just a beat longer at the table, moments when her fingers hovered over her notepad like they wanted to speak, even if her mouth still wouldn't. One morning, Elias found a folded note beside the sugar tin. The paper was torn from a larger page, its edges uneven and soft from handling. The words, though still slanted and uneven, held a weight that tugged at him. I used to sing. He stared at it for a long while before placing it gently in the tin where the sugar lived, as if it were something sweet worth preserving. He didn't ask for more, didn't want to scare whatever it was that had started to bloom. But the next day, another note came. Left under the plate after breakfast, I stopped speaking when I was 14. He read it twice, then 3 times, before setting it aside. His heart beat differently after that, slower, heavier. That night, the wind picked up, sweeping against the windows with the sound of dry leaves scraping across bone. Elias sat in his chair, his knees aching from a day spent mending fence posts. When he heard Sadie moving in the kitchen, not the usual soft-footed rhythm of chores, but a slower, more deliberate shuffle, he rose, his joints protesting, and stepped quietly to the doorframe. She stood at the table, her notepad open, pencil trembling in her hand. She looked up when she noticed him, startled, but she didn't run. Instead, she tore out the page, walked to him, and held it out with both hands. Elias took it gently. I saw something burn. I smelled it on his coat. I said I wouldn't tell. Then I didn't speak again. His breath caught. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but said none of them. Instead, he motioned to the bench by the fireplace and sat down slowly. She followed, hands clutched in her lap. You don't have to explain, he said softly. Not unless you want to. Sadie nodded, eyes on the floor. She took the notepad again and wrote, It was in Texas. I lived with him, my 5th home. He said he'd stop hurting me if I kept quiet. Elias felt something hot rise behind his eyes. Rage, sorrow, helplessness, none of it unfamiliar, but sharper now, because it wasn't about him. It was about this girl in his kitchen, this quiet creature who moved like a ghost and now sat beside him with truths heavy enough to drown. She kept writing, faster, now. A neighbor saw bruises, told someone. They asked me. I didn't speak. They dropped the case. I was sent away. He read it all, then laid the pencil down. You were just a child, he murmured. That's not on you. Sadie blinked. A tear welled at the corner of her eye, but she didn't let it fall. You're safe now, Elias said. "No one's gonna touch you here. Not while I've got breath in me." For a moment, the house was completely still, the kind of still that doesn't need explanation, only presence. The fire crackled low, throwing soft light on the wooden floor, and Elias felt something inside him shift, not out of pity, but out of recognition. He knew what it meant to carry grief that didn't have a name. He knew the weight of silence, how it could wrap around your ribs and squeeze until you forgot what air felt like. He reached forward, not to touch her, but to pick up the pencil again. He wrote a single line on the corner of the page. "I lost someone too. My wife, my daughter. In a fire." Sadie stared at the words. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached out and underlined fire. Just once. Then she tapped the pencil beside it. They sat there like that for a long time, not talking, not moving, just letting the fire speak for them. It hissed and popped, like it understood. Eventually, Sadie stood, picked up the notes, and tucked them into her notebook. She looked at Elias for a long moment, and for the first time since arriving, she touched his shoulder, just lightly, a gesture not of need, but of gratitude. She disappeared into the back room, and Elias sat alone by the fire, staring into the dying flames. He didn't sleep that night, couldn't. His mind kept circling the idea that maybe, just maybe, this house, once filled with ash and ghosts, might still have something left to offer. The next morning, when he came into the kitchen, there was no breakfast waiting, no smell of cornbread or stew, just a note, folded and left beside the salt jar. "I am not afraid of the stove anymore." It made his chest ache more than anything she'd written before. It was just past noon when the knock came, a hard, sharp rap against the front door that echoed too cleanly through the stillness of the house. Elias McRae had been patching a cracked stirrup strap near the fire. Fingers stiff from years of hard weather and harder memory. When the sound pulled him upright like a wire had been yanked through his spine, he stood, set the leather aside, and moved slowly toward the door. Sadie Quinn was in the kitchen, peeling apples, a bowl of thin slices resting on her lap. She froze mid-motion, knife halted in the air, eyes locked on the front of the house. Elias could feel the shift in her. She wasn't just startled, she was afraid. He opened the door. The man standing on the porch wore a long black coat, dusty from the road, and a hat pulled low over a face that was too clean for a cowboy and too sharp for a preacher. His smile was tight, mechanical, a crease with no warmth behind it. When he tipped his hat, his eyes met Elias's, blue, cold, and utterly unreadable. "Afternoon," the man said smoothly. "You Elias McRae, I am," Elias answered, voice flat and guarded. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, offering it like a business card. "Name's Lorne Thatch. I've come up from Texas, kin to Sadie Quinn. Her mother was my cousin. I'm here to take her home." Elias didn't move, didn't reach for the paper. "She hasn't mentioned you," Lorne gave a shrug, easy and dismissive. "Family fell apart after her ma passed. Girl got passed around some. I didn't get word till recently, but I've filed with the county, got full custody rights here. That's all legal." He gave a smug little shake of the document, got the stamp and everything. Behind him, Sadie stepped into the hallway. The bowl in her hands trembled. Her face had gone pale as paper. Her eyes met Elias's for only a second, and that was all it took. Something in that look, raw and wordless, told him everything. Elias took the paper at last, unfolded it. It was real. County seal, signature, official language. Lorne Thatch was listed as guardian by law. I don't recall the church mentioning any next of kin, Elias said, eyes never leaving the man. Lorne's grin thinned. Church did what it could. Temporary measure, you understand. Charity's all fine and good, but blood comes first. Always has. Elias folded the paper slowly, deliberately, and tucked it into his vest pocket. His jaw tightened. Why now? He asked. Lorne blinked. Beg your pardon. Why, after all this time, Elias repeated, you let her bounce from home to home for years, and now you show up with paperwork. Lorne's tone sharpened. You don't have a claim here, mister? I do, and I'll have her ready by morning. With that, he turned and strode back to his wagon, hitched near the edge of the fence line. The wheels creaked as he climbed into the seat. He didn't look back. Elias closed the door slowly. Sadie stood behind him, shaking, the bowl of apples forgotten in her hands. He reached for the notepad she now carried with her everywhere, a habit that had become almost sacred. She grabbed it quickly, hands trembling, and scribbled furiously. He was my last foster, the one before Kansas. He hurt me. Elias's throat tightened. She wrote more, faster now, barely pausing. A neighbor saw bruises, reported it. He was questioned. Charges dropped. They said I made it up. Elias read the page twice, then a third time. He held it gently in his large, calloused hands, like it was made of glass. His jaw clenched, behind his ribs. Something coiled like a rope pulled too tight. I won't let him take you, he said. Sadie looked up, eyes wide, but not hopeful. Just tired. She scribbled 2 more words. He's careful. That night, Elias saddled his horse and rode into Jerome. The sheriff there, Tom Abernathy, was an old friend of Abigail's, a man Elias had once traded winter coats with during a snowstorm that stranded them both in a mountain pass. Tom still wore the same tin star, though his belly had grown and his eyes had dulled with age. Elias showed him the document, the notes Sadie had written, even described her fear, the way she flinched when Thatch's name was spoken. Tom listened, jaw tight, brow furrowed, but when Elias finished, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. Jacob, he said, using Elias's middle name, the one only old friends got to use. I believe you. Hell, I don't trust that man's eyes any more than you do. But those papers are clean. There's no record of him being charged. Just an investigation that went nowhere. Elias gritted his teeth. You'd let her go back to that. Tom looked away. It's the law. My hands are tied. Elias left without another word. He rode home in the dark, the moon hanging low and heavy over the ridgelines. The cold bit through his coat like it had teeth. By the time he dismounted at the porch, his hands were numb, and his heart was colder still. Inside, Sadie sat at the table, hands folded tight, lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't touched her supper. Elias removed his hat and set it on the peg. I tried, he said, voice hoarse. The law doesn't care what I know, only what it sees on paper. Sadie nodded once, then slowly. She picked up her pencil and wrote 2 words, I know. There was no plea in her eyes, no desperation, only resignation, and that, more than anything, broke him. The dawn came slow and colorless, like someone had wrung all the gold out of the sky and left only the bones of morning behind. Elias McRae stood at the window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. It had long gone cold, but he didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where dust stirred along the road that led toward his ranch. It would not be long now. Behind him, the house was too quiet, even for its usual quiet. Sadie Quinn moved like a ghost in the kitchen. Packing what little she owned into the satchel, she had arrived with just a few pieces of clothing. A notebook, a single photo tucked between 2 pages like a pressed flower. She didn't cry, didn't pause, but Elias could hear it in every step, resignation moving her feet more than will. He couldn't stop replaying his conversation with the sheriff. The word tied ringing in his ears like an insult. The law, tied, his hands, tied, a girl's life, tied to a piece of paper that no one cared enough to question. He had spent his life following rules, even when they didn't make sense. He had never raised a fist first, never broken a law, but now every muscle in his body wanted to move, wanted to fight, tear up that paper, throw Lorne Thatch off his land, and tell the law to come find him if it dared. But he didn't, because the man he had been all these years was still in him, and that man didn't know how to bend the world without breaking it. He turned from the window just as Sadie appeared in the doorway, her hat in her hand, the satchel's strap over her shoulder. Her face was set, not in fear, but in steel. Elias had seen that look before on soldiers too young to die but marching into gunfire anyway. He knelt down, slowly, until he was eye level with her. "You don't have to speak," he said softly, "but if you want to stay, I will fight for you, no matter the cost." Sadie looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment something cracked in her expression. Her lips parted, her hand clenched around the brim of her hat, and her eyes shone, but then, just like that, it was gone. She shook her head once. The kind of gesture that ends things. Outside, the crunch of wagon wheels broke through the silence. "Let's go," Girl Lorne's voice barked from beyond the fence, sharp, impatient. Sadie stepped forward, her boots echoed on the wooden floor with finality. She turned to Elias once more at the doorway, eyes brimming, and then bit her lip so hard it bled. He watched her walk away, the soft slam of the screen door ringing louder than thunder. He didn't follow, not at first. He stood in the doorway, long after the dust from the wagon had settled into the road. Only when the silence truly returned did he notice the folded scrap of paper on the kitchen table. Torn from her notebook, one word. "Oh." It hit him like a fist to the chest, not because it was cryptic, but because it wasn't. It was a cry, a gasp, a sound not spoken but written when no breath could hold it. It was grief distilled into 2 letters. Elias sat down hard, the paper clenched in his hand, and let his elbows rest on the table, head bowed. The days that followed moved like molasses in winter, thick, relentless, cold. He fed the horses, checked the fence, boiled coffee that tasted like ash. The kitchen was clean but empty. Her apron still hung on the hook. The jar of flour hadn't been touched. Her chair remained slightly pulled out from the table, as if she might walk back in at any moment and sit without a word. But she didn't. And he didn't expect her to. Not really. The night after she left, Elias lit a lamp in the kitchen window and placed it just behind the sink where it could be seen from the road. He left it burning long after midnight. The next night, he did the same, then again, and again. He didn't say why, didn't explain it to himself, much less to anyone else. But each evening, as the sun dipped behind the western ridges and the shadows lengthened over the dry, cracked ground, he would light the lamp and place it in the window. One night, he placed a note inside her satchel before she left, folded twice, written with hands that hadn't penned anything personal in years. "If you want to come back, just walk toward the kitchen light. I'll leave it on every night." The storm rolled in with a fury that felt personal, like the sky itself had grown tired of holding back. Thunder cracked across the ridgelines like bones breaking in the dark, and the wind howled through the mesquite trees with a voice old as the desert. Rain came down in sheets, thick and slanted, hammering the tin roof of the ranch house in a rhythm so wild it nearly drowned out the fire. Elias McRae sat in his chair by the hearth, boots unlaced, shoulders heavy, one hand wrapped around a glass of rye he hadn't touched. The kitchen lamp still burned in the window, casting a soft glow against the dark. He left it on, just like he said he would, night after night, even when part of him whispered it was foolish. She wasn't coming back. The world didn't work that way. Not for people like him, not for girls like Sadie Quinn, whose whole life had been about surviving, not returning. Still, the lamp stayed lit. It was nearly midnight when the knock came, if you could call it that. It wasn't strong. It wasn't certain. It was frantic, barely 3 taps, but each one rang louder than the storm outside. Elias froze. He set the glass down, slow as breath, and rose to his feet like something ancient was waking in his chest. His boots thudded against the floorboards, each step steady, deliberate, heart pounding so loud it filled the silence between thunderclaps. When he reached the door, he paused for only a moment before pulling it open, and there she was. Sadie stood in the rain, soaked to the skin, barefoot and shivering, her dress clinging to her thin frame like it was the only thing holding her together. One cheek was bruised, dark and swelling. Her hair was plastered to her face, tangled and dripping. Her arms wrapped tight around herself, not from the cold, but from something deeper, like she was holding in the last of her strength, afraid if she let go, she'd fall apart. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. Elias stepped aside. Sadie crossed the threshold without hesitation. Water pooled beneath her feet. Mud trailed behind her. The house, so clean and orderly these past weeks, now held the chaos of her return like a wound reopened. He didn't ask questions, didn't reach for her. He knelt, slowly, reverently, as if every motion carried weight. He took her feet in his hands, those bare, bruised, bleeding feet, and without a word. Reached for the old linen cloth. Abigail had embroidered with blue thread so many years ago. He dipped it in warm water, wrung it gently, and began to wash the dirt away. Sadie stared down at him, eyes glassy, but didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. Her hands dropped to her sides, limp, and her shoulders began to shake, not violently, just enough. He finished gently, dried her with a clean towel, then stood and wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders. Only then did he reach for her. She fell into his arms without resistance. There was no sound, no sob, no spoken gratitude, just the weight of her body against his chest, the way her breath hitched, the way she clung, not like a child, but like someone who had finally stopped running. He held her firmly, not as a savior, not as a protector, but as a man who had waited every night for the impossible, and now found himself afraid to breathe in case it vanished. They stayed like that for a long time, the storm raging beyond the windows, the fire hissing as wet clothes dripped onto the floor. Later, he made her tea, wrapped her hands around the warm mug, sat beside her as her breath slowed and the color returned to her face. Little by little, she hadn't spoken a word. She didn't need to. The silence was different now. He laid out fresh clothes, one of his flannel shirts, soft from age, and made a bed for her by the fire. She lay down without protest, curling into the warmth like a stray animal finally invited inside. That night, for the first time in years, Sadie Quinn slept without a nightmare, and Elias, watching from the chair beside her, didn't sleep either, not because of fear or habit, but because he couldn't stop watching the rise and fall of her breath, because something had changed, and he was afraid of what it meant to hope again. Morning came slow and soft, the kind that crept in through the windows without announcement, letting the house warm in its own time. Outside, the rain had stopped, though the world still wore the sheen of it, mud clinging to the fence posts, droplets hanging from the eaves like tiny beads of glass. The air smelled clean, like the desert had been washed of its weight. In the kitchen, Elias McRae stood barefoot, a towel slung over one shoulder, stirring a pot of oats with one hand and cradling a chipped coffee mug in the other. The fire crackled behind him. Every now and then, he glanced over his shoulder to the small bedroll by the hearth where Sadie Quinn still slept, curled beneath one of his old wool blankets, her breathing steady, her cheeks no longer hollow. She stirred when the scent of cinnamon touched the air, not all at once, just a small shift in her shoulders, then the slow blink of waking. She sat up slowly, rubbing her hands across her face, and looked around like someone waking in a different life. Elias didn't speak. He poured a ladle of oats into a bowl and set it on the table, alongside a spoon, a cloth napkin, and a small jar of honey. Sadie came to the table in silence. She wore one of his flannel shirts. It hung nearly to her knees, but there was something more solid about the way she moved now. Less like a shadow, more like someone deciding to take up space again. They ate quietly, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one had warmth in it, like sun on the porch rail. It didn't need filling, it just was. After breakfast, she helped wash the dishes, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked behind her ears. Elias caught himself watching the way she handled the plates, not like a servant or a guest, but like someone returning to something that had almost been lost. He said nothing, but she noticed. Later that afternoon, as the sun broke through the cloud cover and the fields began to steam in the heat, Sadie returned to the kitchen alone. Elias was outside chopping wood, his rhythm steady, each strike of the axe like punctuation against the dirt. Inside, Sadie opened the drawer where she'd kept her notebook and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She read it once, then twice, her eyes scanning the words she had written long ago, words of warning, of fear, of remembering. Then she set it aside and picked up a fresh sheet. This time, she wrote slowly, not out of fear, but care. By the time Elias came back inside, dust and sweat clinging to him like old regrets, she had already gone to her small room. But on the table lay the folded note. He read it carefully. I don't know how to be safe, but I think this place remembers how, and I want to remember, too. He folded the paper without a word and tucked it into the same pocket where he kept the note from weeks ago, the one that only said, "Thank you for the coffee." That evening, they cooked together. It was a quiet thing, without ceremony. She chopped onions while he kneaded dough, both of them moving in unspoken agreement, when she wiped her eyes from the sting. Elias handed her a cloth, and she took it with the faintest smile. They didn't laugh. Not yet. But they came close. Before bed. Elias pulled a wooden box from the top of the pantry shelf. Dust covered the lid. Inside were Abigail's old recipe cards, some faded, some smeared, some written in a looping hand that missed lines and added sugar where it didn't belong. He passed the box to Sadie. You might find something worth saving, he said. She opened it with the reverence of someone unfolding a letter from a past life. Her fingers brushed over the cards, stopping on one that read, "Sweet milk bread." for winter mornings. She traced the title with her fingertip. I used to wake up to that smell, Elias said quietly. I never learned how to make it. Figured it wasn't mine to know. Sadie looked up, then reached for the small pencil she now kept tucked in the spine of her notebook. On the edge of the card, she wrote, "We can learn it together." That night, the house felt different. Not just quieter, not just warmer, but more alive. Elias sat by the fire long after Sadie went to bed, holding the recipe card in his hands, rubbing his thumb across her handwriting, not quite believing how far they'd come, and how much further they might still go. By the time spring settled into the valley for good, the ground had softened enough for planting, and the air carried more bird song than wind. The days were longer, the light warmer, and everything seemed to stretch just a little farther than it had in months, including them. Elias McRae stood by the barn, rubbing linseed oil into the handle of a spade, watching from a distance as Sadie Quinn crouched near the herb patch, her hands buried in soil, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her braid was half undone, wisps of hair curling at her neck, and dirt smudged her cheeks. But there was a stillness in her expression that hadn't been there before, not the stillness of fear, the stillness of being. He remembered when Abigail used to hum, while planting no tune in particular, just sound for the sake of it. Sadie didn't hum. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the silence in a different way. That afternoon, Elias found her sketchbook open on the kitchen table. She had drawn a long wooden table surrounded by small chairs, child-sized. Underneath, in her neat, slightly slanted handwriting, she'd written cooking class for the orphanage girls. Tuesdays, if the church agrees. Elias looked down at the drawing and felt something turn over in his chest. Not pain, not quite pride. Something closer to awe. She didn't ask. She simply began. 2 weeks later, he helped her clear out the side shed near the barn and turned it into a small classroom. They scrubbed the floor, hung gingham curtains, set up shelves with mixing bowls and spoons. Elias built the long wooden table by hand, smoothing every corner with a patience he hadn't felt in years. When he finished, Sadie ran her fingers along the wood and left a small note pinned to the underside. This is more than a table. The first Tuesday, 6 girls came, escorted by one of the sisters from the mission house in Jerome. Sadie greeted them all with a smile, not big, but real. She handed each child a small apron she had sewn herself, their initials stitched in red thread. They didn't mind that she didn't speak. Children never question silence the way adults do. They filled the space with laughter, flour, dropped eggs, and joy so loud it made Elias step outside and lean against the fence just to catch his breath. He watched through the window as Sadie moved among them, tapping shoulders, pointing to recipe cards, showing how to stir gently, how to taste before serving. One girl asked if onions always made people cry. Sadie nodded, then scribbled on a chalkboard, "Only if you let them." The room erupted in giggles. Later that evening, after the girls had left and the classroom smelled of cinnamon and cocoa, Elias found Sadie standing in the doorway, arms folded, watching the sunset as if she'd never seen it from this angle before. "You did good today," he said. She turned her head, then passed him a note. They laughed, and I didn't feel small. He didn't reply, just reached out, ruffled her hair like he might have done to Lily once, then walked inside. Days passed. The rhythm deepened. Mornings began with bread, dough thumping against the counter, the sharp scent of fresh herbs from the garden, and quiet notes Sadie left in strange places. One appeared on the bathroom mirror. "You snore less when you fall asleep by the fire." Another tucked under his dinner plate. "I like this place in spring. I think I want to stay." Each note made Elias pause, longer than he meant to. He folded some into his wallet, others he kept in a tin box under the bed. Then one evening, after supper, he found a folded slip of paper placed gently atop his book on the mantel. He opened it slowly. "I am not afraid anymore. Nothing more. No signature. No explanation." He stared at the words until they blurred. Then, without thinking, he folded it and slid it into his breast pocket, over his heart. That night, a thunderstorm crept across the valley. Not wild like the one before, but slow, rolling, with flashes of lightning that lit the room in bursts. Elias stirred from his sleep at the sound of movement. He rose and stepped toward the hallway. Sadie's door was ajar. She sat on the edge of her cot, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around herself, her breath tight and uneven. The storm hadn't touched her body, but it had found its way back into her memory. He crouched beside her. "It's me," he said gently. "You're safe. I won't touch you unless you want me to. But you're not alone." She looked at him, eyes wide, but steady. Then she nodded once. He opened his arms, not a demand, an offering. She leaned forward, slow as sunrise, and rested her head against his chest. And this time, she didn't tremble. The days lengthened slowly, the way they do when spring leans towards summer sunrise coming sooner, dusk dragging its feet across the sky like it didn't want to leave. The land began to hum again, quietly, with the sound of bees and wildflowers, the soft creak of saddle leather, the rustle of green returning where brown had once held sway. At the McRae ranch, life found a rhythm not grand, not loud, but steady. Sadie Quinn spent her mornings with the garden and the children, her afternoons at the stove or sketching quiet thoughts in her notebook. Elias McRae split wood, repaired fences, taught her how to read the clouds and listen to the animals' restlessness before a storm. And some nights, they sat by the fire without speaking at all, just presence, just peace. One morning, Elias walked into the kitchen to find Sadie hunched over the counter, flour on her cheek, the old recipe box open beside her. She looked up as he entered, hands deep in dough, and raised an eyebrow. "You trying to poison me again?" he teased, voice dry but warm. She wiped her hands on a towel and picked up a small card. On it, she pointed to Abigail's handwriting, sweet milk bread for winter mornings. "Where'd you find that one?" he asked, walking closer. Sadie motioned to the back cabinet, the one where Abigail used to stash holiday recipes and old dried herbs. Elias shook his head slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting. She always used a backwards S when she rushed. Swore it was faster. Sadie grinned, not with her mouth, but with her eyes, her shoulders, her whole presence. Then she scribbled on a nearby scrap of parchment, "I like her." She skipped steps, but the bread never failed. Elias chuckled and stepped back. "I trust your baking. I don't trust your sense of humor." Over the next few weeks, the ranch bloomed not just with crops, but with laughter in the dirt. Small notes left in apron pockets, the thump of dough, the soft squeal of children's delight when their cookies didn't burn. Sadie began to laugh sometimes, not loudly, but enough. Once, when Elias fell off a mule, trying to impress her by standing on the saddle, she laughed so hard she had to sit down in the grass. He wore the bruise for a week, and the smile for longer. One evening, after dinner, Elias found a folded slip of paper tucked beneath his plate. It was different, this time, thicker parchment, carefully pressed. He opened it slowly. I am not afraid anymore. No extra words, no embellishment, just that. He held it in his hands a long while, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. The following day, he disappeared into the barn for hours. Sadie didn't ask where he'd gone. She just kept cooking, her apron dusted in flour, humming something tuneless but comforting. That evening, he returned, calloused fingers holding a piece of sanded pine, small and warm to the touch. Carved into it with his pocket knife were 6 words: "Stay, Sadie." Not as a guest. As my wife. He didn't say anything, just placed it in front of her on the kitchen table and stepped back. She picked it up, traced the carving with her fingertips, and closed her eyes. Her tears came quietly, like petals falling. Then she nodded. A week later, under the gold light of late spring, they married in the chapel outside Jerome. Father Coulson presided, and a few neighbors gathered, bringing wildflowers and cornbread. Sadie wore a dress stitched from linen she'd found in Abigail's old trunk, and Elias wore his best shirt, the one he hadn't touched since the funeral. There were no long vows, no speeches, just 2 pieces of paper, folded neatly. Elias read his aloud, hands steady. I once believed love ended with silence, that grief made a man whole in its own way. But you came and taught me that silence can speak, grief can mend, and soup well. Soup can save a life. Sadie handed him hers, sealed with a linen ribbon. He opened it and read in silence, I cannot promise I will always smile, but I will never leave the kitchen without waiting for you to sit beside me. After the wedding, Sadie began teaching cooking classes for the orphanage children full-time. Elias built her a new kitchen table, wide enough for 10 small hands and twice as many bowls. They called it Sadie's table, though she said it should be Elias's backache. Elias planted a greenhouse beside the barn. Tomatoes, lettuce, rosemary, sage. A little sign hung above the door, Clara's Garden. Sadie never corrected it. She liked the name. Above the kitchen stove, they framed a square of old embroidered linen, stitched in simple letters, where fire failed, soup healed. Pinned to the bottom was a dried white daisy. Years later, no one remembered the exact day she first returned, or when he lit the lamp, or when the first note was left by the coffee tin. But they remembered how the house felt after that, alive again, not because of fire or prayer, but because someone waited, and someone came home. And that was enough. Some silences aren't empty, they're full of things we couldn't say. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes, it begins with a bowl of soup, a soft light left on, or the quiet patience to simply stay. Elias and Sadie never rushed to fix each other. They didn't try to erase the past. Instead, they made room for it one small, steady day at a time. For those of us carrying our own quiet grief, or walking alongside someone who does, this story is a gentle invitation to listen more deeply, to offer warmth without asking for anything back, and to believe that it's never too late to begin again. Whether you're 30 or 70, it's a reminder that kindness still changes lives, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit beside someone and let them know they're home. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, sharing, or subscribing to Wild West Echoes. Every click helps these quiet, more powerful stories Find someone who needs them. We'll be here each week, bringing forgotten voices and frontier souls back to life, one story at a time. Until next time, take care and keep a light on. Someone might be finding their way home.